So the goal of this is to kind of debrief a little bit of the Jack Kruse podcast that we had released a few weeks back, which was on all things EMFs, biological semiconduction, a whole lot of stuff that honestly, if I listened to it like 8 months ago, I would have had no idea what was going on. So the idea here is to kind of parse out some of that stuff, share my knowledge on EMFs, a little bit about biological semiconduction, and maybe have a Q&A at the end. So we got some questions already that people tweeted at us, which we will answer. And then if anyone wants to stay on, we'll probably do a Q&A, in like 45 to 60 minutes. So
perfect.
Well, yeah, Ryan, what did you think of the podcast? Did you learn a lot?
So yes, it was completely groundbreaking to me. If anyone here listened to the whole thing, you'll hear me speak 2 times for maybe 20 seconds in total. And both times I was very impressed that I was coherent because my brain was like literally like flipped on its head. I hate to say that it was like one of the podcasts we've done that was like perfect all the way through because there was just so much good juice in there and it was like, it just flowed. But for me, the biggest eye-opening things weren't necessarily things that I learned that were new. It was more so clarification on the things that I already had a hunch about. So for me, it made me just feel good about things I had already implemented, like not living in LA, for one. And I think for me, it was more about just bringing a bigger message across that this is probably the biggest threat that, generally speaking, we face in modern times for health. Because if we think about food, we only eat maybe 3 times a day. Even for all those people that snack 20 times a day, you're still subjected to Wi-Fi 24 hours a day. It's nonstop. So when it comes to non-native EMF, it's probably the most difficult thing to mitigate, or dare I say even remove. So the first thing I guess I was going to ask you coming out of it is like 5G is sort of a big talking point, and then 6G is even scarier when we think about that in the future. But what are the risks to our health? And we can sort of debrief, kind of unpack what we talked about with Jack, because we kind of got into topology and various things that are a little more in depth.
Yeah, well, what you said is definitely true. I think people need to realize that this is probably the most pervasive environmental toxin, and there is no avoiding it, really. I mean, completely. It's impossible, right? So that's not really the goal, is perfection. The goal is to mitigate, substantially. And people always say to me that that's like unrealistic, but there are actually very simple things you can do and very simple things we could have done in like home design, just the way we route our internet, wired versus wireless. Distance, obviously, of using technology is tremendously important. So all these things, and we can get into a lot of that. But 5G is definitely a big topic, and I've been researching a ton about this even since the podcast. And I think Jack definitely talked a lot about kind of the waveform, and we talked a little bit about things like jump conduction and higher frequency bands being really bad for oxygen in our biology, and these are all very true things. But 5G is definitely it's a nuanced topic, and it's quite interesting because it's actually kind of been a dud from the technology perspective. So it's not really fully rolled out. It's actually not fully rolled out at all in the sense of the higher frequencies. So to give people an overview, 5G just means like 5th generation wireless technology. And the biggest differences between any wireless generation is speed and latency. So it's taking speed up, another 10 to 100x, latency down another 10 to 20x. So that's really the biggest difference between all generations, and it's substantially improved from 4G LTE, which is the last generation before that. So how are they doing that, right? They obviously have to innovate on the engineering side of things in order to get faster speeds and lower latency times. So what they're doing is they are using different frequency bands, higher frequency bands. They have changed the way that they're sending the beam or the radio frequency wave. They're using a modality called beamforming, which we can get into that. And then
I would love that.
And then they're also have updated and kind of modernize as well the towers, the antenna arrays that they use. So they use a technique called multiple input, multiple output antenna arrays, which has been used in 4G in the past, but now they're taking it to another level, which is called massive multiple input, multiple output. Literally, that's what it's called, massive MIMO or MIMO, depending on how you want to say the acronym. So, and there's a few other things like full duplexing, which is where you can send and receive the transmission signal. You can transmit and receive a signal at the same exact time. So there's a lot of innovation ongoing, but definitely the biggest one for 5G that most people know about is the fact that they're using millimeter waves, which is a higher frequency band. Millimeter referring to the wavelength, which is smaller wavelength, which is higher frequency. So the frequency bands is kind of like 20 to 40, 50 gigahertz, and there's various bands within there assigned to the specific telecom carriers such as Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. And that's about a 10x jump from what we've been using in 4G LTE. Things like Wi-Fi are at 2.4 gigahertz, 2.5 gigahertz, and even standard calling a lot of times is at like 900 megahertz to 1 gigahertz. So jumping it up to 20, 30, 40 is a big deal. However, I would like to preface, this is not really being used even today in 2024 yet, because there are a lot of challenges. So getting into the challenges is the range on higher frequency waves is abysmal because it gets eaten up by atmospheric gases such as oxygen and water vapor, which again, think about oxygen and water, and they are absorbing the electromagnetic wave in the higher frequency bands. We have oxygen, gas, and water all throughout our biology. So there's a little teaser on why 5G might be bad for us. So the range is really bad. Some of the frequencies can only go, like a kilometer. So they're really only have use in cities. But then this is why you see all these towers being built, the repeater towers, because they need massive amount of infrastructure in terms of towers to keep the signal going. And it's really a problem because that's the reason why they've had to engineer the waveform completely different. So the beamforming technology is basically stacking waves on top of each other to get a very powerful but narrow angle of incidence. So instead of 4G, which uses omnidirectional beams, which basically is spraying 4G radio frequency waves 360 degrees, like all around, 5G is like a targeted beam at the receiver. So, and it's tracking you and it's following you around. So that's bad because it's much higher power because they're stacking the waves via beamforming. But it's actually good because I think it's easier to avoid it. You could turn the receiver off. And if you're not in a major city, then, it is definitely easily avoidable. And again, this is being used in 5G throughout, but the millimeter waves have really not been rolled out, even in cities. They've kind of been like tested, but there's 3 frequency bands. There's low band, mid band, and high band. The high band is the millimeter waves. The mid band is kind of like 3 to 4 gigahertz, so it's a bit higher than things we used in the past. That's what's mostly being used right now, and they're still seeing like improvements with speed and everything like that. So it's an interesting situation because it's definitely a problem from the power intensity perspective and the fact that it's very direct, but at the same time it's also a bit more easily avoidable. And the millimeter waves especially are blocked not only by or dissipated in the atmospheric gases, but also blocked by physical things like trees and buildings to some degree, not completely. So that's kind of a quick overview, but it's a lot of technical information. I just wrote a thread, I wrote a Substack article on that, but it's really important because it's like this is all completely different from 4G in the past.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the biggest thing for me is because the distance traveled is so much shorter. Um, they need, like you said, more towers. So the prevalence is like much more compact. So I've noticed it living in like Salt Lake, but just traveling to other places as well, like any city. There's just they're all over the place. I actually count them on my drives sometimes just to like see. And as I've been looking for houses for myself, it's sort of like, okay, where can I find a place that's like not directly next to a thing? It's almost impossible when you live in such a high density community. And so that's to me like really the, for lack of a better word, danger is the proximity. And that's actually what Jack brought up in the podcast was there's no biohack for this stuff. It's get the fuck away from it was basically what he said. And that's the truth. Like no harmonizer is going to freaking protect your nutsack with this silver underwear to protect your fertility from this stuff. But like you said, there's a lot of things you can do proactively in your own home, but you got to, be mindful of the environment and, not pretend like it's all hunky dory. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's definitely completely changed the fact that cities are, I mean, they already were pretty detrimental to our health, but now high population areas are significantly worse because of the 5G rollout. And you see that with, yeah, like you said, how many towers are in, a 2 square mile area now in populated cities. They're everywhere, and they have to be because of the nature of the 5G network, and that's only going to continue to be built out in terms of infrastructure, in terms of repeaters. They're going to have them on like major office buildings and areas like that,
Yep.
entertainment venues, downtown areas, anything that's like smart city vibes. It's all going to be 5G, and that's when we'll start rolling out millimeter waves. So that's the scary part, is they haven't even really started using millimeter waves. And you already see, I mean, there's already a massive effect probably, and you see that, or you could debate that with, a lot of rise in chronic disease, rise in, died suddenly, is what effect that has. So we can get into that. But to me, it's definitely easier to avoid it if you move to the suburbs. If you just turn 5G off on your phone, you are kind of getting rid of that receiver. So it's not able to follow you around. You're still getting blasted with 4G, omnidirectionally, which is what it is, unless you turn your phone on airplane mode. But I think that's really important for people to understand, is that 5G is it's a very targeted waveform, and it's a very engineered waveform. It's a very high power because it's a very low angle of incidence. But my concern is, yeah, if, say, you turn everything off, you're doing yourself a service by turning off you as the receiver, but you live in a very populated area. Everyone around
Yeah.
you is
Then,
affecting you. So, if your friend, if your
yeah.
neighbor, if everyone in a downtown area has 5G on, but you don't, it doesn't really matter. Because even,
Well, and I,
yeah, I was just gonna say,
I was just
because
gonna
that
say,
angle is probably going through you at some point if there's that many transmission signals in the highly densely populated area.
yeah, and I think about in certain, I see because housing is such an issue, just from a price market point of view. You see all these sort of like townhouse situations being built and like apartment complexes going up everywhere because they're more quote affordable. But I think about like how even more tightly knit you're going to have with exposure just from your surrounding environment, from other people being in such close proximity. Definitely not doing the things that you are probably doing if you're listening to this live stream right now. So it's sort of like in cities, it gets harder and harder and harder as time goes on to optimize just because of the way the nature of this thing works. I kind of wanted to ask you though, unless you have something else to say about that, about like the oxygen and water stuff, just because we did mention it a bit in there. I know we brought up hypoxia decently often during the podcast, but maybe you can kind of talk about the mechanism of that, because I know I've personally felt it. Like you can feel sort of the hypoxic environment that you're in, having gone outside of it into a more natural environment or camping for a week or backpacking. You feel the difference. It's incredible. You notice it a lot in sleep as well, which was brought up on the podcast on several occasions about how these affect your ability to recover because you're not getting as quality sleep.
Yeah, so the oxygen absorption and also the water absorption, which I just recently learned more about. So, again, reiterating why 5G signals, why higher frequency waves have such terrible range, a big reason is because it gets dissipated tremendously in the atmosphere or in air by oxygen gas and water vapor. And you can look this up right now and you can look up millimeter waves absorbed by oxygen gas, and an insane graph will come up and it'll show a crazy peak at like 60 gigahertz, and then it'll kind of die down, and then there'll be another crazy peak at like 100 120 gigahertz. And it's really crazy, but what I also found is that there's a similar plot, and you can kind of superimpose them on top of each other so that water vapor is also doing the same thing at slightly different frequencies. So at like 24 gigahertz, which is a common millimeter wave frequency that they're going to roll out, water vapor absorbs a ton of this electromagnetic radiation. And that's a concern, right? Because what is happening in our body? Oxygen, we're breathing in air, we have oxygen as the final electron acceptor in a mitochondria electron transport chain. It's imperative. It's so important for our biology, and then so is water. And although it's water vapor in the air, from what I have found, a decades old study from, I think it was the Department of Defense, is saying the same thing about water vapor, that water in a liquid or vapor form absorbs a tremendous amount of these radio frequencies once you get above 10 gigahertz. So to me, this is really scary, and it's kind of a problem because we just don't know the biological effects. And it's this giant research experiment on society, once again, that we haven't consented to being a part of. And we have to just make assumptions, right? Like, they haven't tested these biological mechanisms of action on the level of oxygen and water, but we know that radio frequencies affect water in our biology. We know how important water is in our biology, and it's a real problem. So that's kind of the biggest issue, in my opinion, with 5G, is we're just charting into this territory of unknowns completely. So it's pretty wild, and something I'm diving a lot deeper into. And Ryan's internet dropped out, so I'm just waiting for him to get back on. But yeah, if you want to look up oxygen absorption of millimeter waves, you can look up water vapor absorption as well, and extrapolate the fact that this might be extremely damaging to our biology, causing pseudohypoxia, which is causing mitochondrial dysfunction, which aligns very well with all of the research on radio frequencies in general at much lower frequencies. Then you could understand why 5G might be extremely bad for our health. And that's something Ryan and I also wanted to get into, is the research, right? So I'm researching millimeter waves, not 5G. Why? Because there's no studies on 5G, really. There's no peer-reviewed studies. Even today, there might be like one or two. And that's not by coincidence. That's not an accident. That's because nobody's going to fund this, or no one wants to put their reputation on the line as a scientist to research this. And it's crazy that they just rolled this out, like 3-4 years ago now, 5 years ago, and there's still very, very, very little research on 5G. All of the millimeter wave research, you have to go back years. Again, I was reading a DoD document from the 80s yesterday on the water vapor absorption spectra of high frequency waves in the 10 to 100 gigahertz range. And then they'll just say, oh, there's no studies, or there's no research, and there's none of this. And, it's all bullshit. So that's how science has been captured by the centralized narrative. And that's something that's extremely concerning to me, but why we need to use common sense. And it's like, if you look at all the data that already exists on 2G, 3G networks, you really think 5G will be less worse for us or equally safe, quote unquote? No, of course not. They're higher energy, photons, and they're also now higher power intensity in terms of the beamforming effects and a more artificially manufactured waveform. So yeah, Brian, you're back on the Twitter space.
Yeah, I'm literally using LTE or whatever because
Okay.
the Wi-Fi is like completely down. But I totally agree with what you just said. And we have like even like the most, I think the NTP studies like reflect that with 1, 2, 3G. And so it's not like none of this really is a question. That's why I get frustrated when people talk about like, oh, it's ionized radiation, blah blah blah, or something like that. It's like it's totally fine, blah blah blah. You can stick your head in the microwave, and you'll be
Well,
good.
that's a good point, and I don't know if you're able to hop back on Riverside, but we'll see there. So Ryan, for those who didn't hear, asked about ionizing versus non-ionizing radiation, and that's I commented on Elon Musk's post today about Starlink providing internet to every place in the world, like just a low network coverage to the entire world, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, that's so great." That's fucking terrible. I don't want to go into the woods and the mountains and nature and have cell signal all the time. That's the whole point, is to escape this bath of radio frequencies. And everyone, commented, "Wow, the power intensity is so low." And well, actually, the smarter people commented that. The really, average NPC would just comment that, non-ionizing radiation has no harmful effects on
Yeah,
biology, and it's crazy because you can literally go look up Dr. Henry Lai has 2,500 studies. More than half of them are on radio frequencies, and they show 75 to 90% of them show harmful biological effects. And it's because they have non-thermal effects. Dr. Martin Powell is another fantastic researcher who hopefully we can interview one of those two guys soon. But there's clear effects in terms of radio frequencies and our health. And you mentioned the NTP study. That's a good example because to me, this is almost like undebatable. Then what happened was the National Toxicology Program spent 10 years, $30 million studying 2G and 3G cell phone radiation effects on rodents, which again, the issue with a lot of these studies and EMFs is they're extremely challenging to do in humans, and they have a lot of industry-funded FUD in the research realm as well. But the NTP study, 10 years, $30 million spent to study the effects of 2G and 3G cell phone radiation from 700 megahertz to 2700 megahertz on rats and mice. And what they found was clear association of malignant tumors in the rats, the hearts of rats, and also some other associations as well. And then they showed clear evidence of DNA damage in the brain and blood cells of the rodents. So that was kind of just an eye-opening moment for a lot of people, but it again got swept under the rug because the power density levels was like slightly higher than what the safety limits are for power density on radio frequencies in terms of cell phone use. And that's, just been, it's disproved because of that, instead of it being 1.5, what is it? I don't know if it's microwatts per centimeter squared or what the units was exactly, but then an institute in Italy basically replicated the study at lower power densities and found similar results. So it's really at this point to me is undebatable that these things are harmful. I mean, there's hundreds, thousands of studies, and then they're just going to tell you that 5G is safe because it's non-ionizing radiation and there's no research on it. But it's because they're not funding. No one's funding any research, and they don't want to get canceled for doing it. So here we are extrapolating while this thing's already been rolled out for 4 or 5 years, and it's kind of gone quiet. COVID, it was a big narrative, right? During COVID,
yeah,
like 5G caused COVID, which we could talk about that.
yeah, I love that.
And then it's kind of gone quiet. I think people have just like come to terms with the fact that they're just going to live in a 5G, bath of frequencies in the cities
Well,
and pay $3,000 a month for an apartment.
This, I mean,
And
there's a few types of people in the world, as we all know. I mean, I always knew in COVID, as a lot of people began to wake up, I probably had more really interesting conversations with people I never thought I'd be talking about this stuff with in 2020, 21. That once stuff kind of blew over, I knew that I'd probably lose over half of those people, maybe. And so it's about reaching the ears that are willing to question, willing to listen, and willing to just like question their. I mean, one of the things that was brought up on the podcast with Jack, and I see Jack's listening in the chat, so I'm sure he can, scrape me on the ground with the things I get wrong in a minute. Um, but he brought up like a lot of the research is decades old. Because that's when we were looking into these things. I mean, with Robert O. Becker way back in the 60s, 70s. And then these people get shut down. Like you mentioned, they can't get funded. We got Pollock, who can't get funded. He had that interesting stuff with Wi-Fi and the exclusion zone water, just completely shutting it down. And so to me, it's like when you have captured research, there's very little that can be achieved on a high level like that. And so it is sort of up to a little bit of intuition to look into things for yourself. You know what I mean?
yeah, I mean, that's like decentralization 101 right there. Science has been captured completely. And if you're going to keep trusting, centralized authority on what's good and what's bad for your health, I mean, you're just not going to make it, right? It's really bad. And yeah, I think, just based on this, based on everything I've, learned and kind of gathered about 5G is I really wouldn't want to be living in a city I wouldn't want to be living in a city right now. And that's why I'm not. That's why I live in central Wyoming in the middle of nowhere.
It keeps
But
me up at night.
I think it's going to get even worse as they roll out millimeter waves and just more infrastructure for smart cities, for 5G. You can get into the autonomous vehicles space as well. Once that gets rolled, it's just going to continue to proliferate. And I really think if you prioritize your health, you want to raise a family, you want to take control of your life, then even a move to the suburbs is a tremendous difference from being downtown. And, just from, again, the money perspective, why the hell would you want to pay $3,000 a month anyway to live in an apartment downtown? You're just wasting your money. So it's the fiat mindset. It's kind of just the repercussions of everything in that realm. And, it's an unrealistic, thing for people to say, is to just move somewhere remote, do whatever you want. Yeah. But you could at least move to the suburbs. You could at least move out of the
For
really
sure.
high traffic areas.
Yeah, I mean, it's really easy to sort of like doomsday everything and just give up or like decide that nothing's worth it and just kind of give in to whatever it is. But there's like a lot of practical stuff you can do. And it's all about preparing for the future and just like spreading educational stuff for people to make better decisions for themselves. Because when you know better, you do better. But I'd love to sort of get into some of the COVID stuff. We just actually had a really, really good podcast about all that stuff. That'll be almost a Twitter, Spotify exclusive, just because of all the stuff we talked about. But well, I don't even know what the whole COVID, like, I honestly wasn't in the loop during all that time. So like, what was the whole like thing with like COVID and 5G and 5G activating COVID shots and stuff? I actually am not familiar with it.
Yeah, well, I think there's a few narratives going around for sure. I think the first one is that, like, straight up that 5G like caused COVID, which isn't really that crazy to say, because if you've read The Invisible Rainbow and some of these books, you realize actually that pandemics, epidemics have kind of been very aligned with new technology rollouts, especially like completely different, innovative technology, whatever you want to call it. And that's, a lot of people were saying that, 5G, they turned up the frequency and we got COVID. But, the data points definitely more to a lab leak, and definitely that sort of funded research, thanks to Fauci and friends. But it also didn't really make sense to me because, again, the millimeter waves haven't even really been rolled out. They've just like tested them. And the mid-band frequency is what they're actually using, which is kind of like 3.5 gigahertz, which isn't too much different from, let's say, Wi-Fi, for example. And in terms of frequency, it's definitely a completely different waveform and power intensity and that sort of thing. So I don't think that 5G caused COVID. But then we can get into the vaccines, the mandates, there were some conspiracy theories around like activation, and there's some
Yeah.
paper going around there, research that actually does say there is research out there that exists that show you can activate a drug delivery payload via a radio frequency signal, and they're using graphene oxide, which is a semiconductor, to carry those drugs into your body. And really, the vaccines are drugs. That was something that was very clear with our interview with Dr. William Mackis, who's our oncologist, radiologist, expert on the truth behind COVID, saying it's not. Yeah, they changed the whole definition of vaccines, and it's really a drug.
Yeah.
Gene therapy, you could even debate. So, is this possible that they could activate drug delivery, vaccine delivery, mRNA technology with a radio frequency signal? Definitely. Like, that is 100% possible. Is that what happened? I don't really think that's what happened, but I would be skeptical that, that could definitely happen in the future. I mean, there's everything. Bill Gates has, GMO mosquitoes that could vaccinate you in the
Yeah.
future. There's so many different
Yeah.
things that could definitely be plausible. But to me, the real issue is that we just have this onslaught now of mitochondrial toxins. So people got the jab, and obviously that's extremely damaging. There's research even from Doug Wallace on spike protein being extremely damaging to the mitochondria, and there's some fringe research saying it's even worse from the vaccine. Obviously, no one's going to fund that type of research, so you have to remember that there's a context here. But you can make the conclusions, and based on what William Mackis said in our podcast on the lipid nanoparticles, the DNA fragments, the SV40, the mRNA, it's kind of just like it's a multifaceted toxin. So you take that, and it's this extremely high dose toxin in a very short period of time. And that probably pushed a lot of people over a threshold, especially if you already had
Mm-hmm.
underlying conditions. And then we're living again in this world of ever increasing EMF exposure, artificial blue light exposure. So this is just driving up mitochondrial dysfunction even higher. So is it?
Well, what do they tell you to do? They tell you to stay inside for a whole year.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you get even worse.
Yeah, and that was even before everyone got jabbed and boosted 5 times. So it's really, and it just shows, right? And as Mac has said, it's compromising the immune system, and people don't understand that the mitochondria is like the hub of immune system signaling. So if you don't have properly functioning mitochondria, your immune system is going to be completely compromised, and you're not going to be able to deal with that. And that's why we see the more times you got jabbed, the worse off you are in fighting COVID. Like, crazy how that works. But and then you see as well, what are all the common issues, right? It's fertility, it's heart issues, literally people dying or having heart attacks, and then it's neuropsychiatric effects. And those are the three, most energy intensive, most mitochondrial rich areas of our biology. And no wonder. And you see, I saw the craziest statistic today that I also mentioned on a podcast I did earlier. South Korea has, like, I think for every 100 South Koreans, only 4 of them are having children or going to have grandchildren.
Wow.
It's fucking crazy. Like, there's and Elon Musk is tweeting about depopulation, but at the same time, he wants to blast the whole world with EMFs. So he doesn't understand that fertility is directly linked to EMF exposure and toxin exposure and mitochondrial dysfunction, because he doesn't understand biology. But to me, it's alarming, and it's really sad. But at the same time, if you are very deliberate about your health, you could be, fine. You just have to understand that this is the environment that we live in. The toxin exposure is higher than ever. So you do have to go out of your way to really reinvigorate your health, regain your health. And if you do want to have a family that's healthy as well, it's going to be really important. I really only think like 5 to 10% of people in like 20 years are going to be the ones repopulating. It's going to be crazy how this plays out.
Well, yeah, and like you said, that's the thing too, is there's so much focus even in our community on this like myopic view of like trying to find the one thing that's causing all these problems, when it's like, don't get me wrong, I think these things are like probably some of the most paramount, like indefinitely, like just like the tech stuff, and just being on screens all day long, especially giving them to kids, and like having kids now in an educational system where like half the time, like in some schools, like half their time is taught on screens. It's like insane. Um, but it's so multifaceted that it becomes overwhelming, I think. And so as we keep going, the things you would need to do to maybe avoid the issues that people are experiencing now or get better from them becomes if infinitely more. You need more, like you need more of it. If you, especially if you're living in a really bad environment, in that case, you're basically screwed anyways. So it's just something that's, it just sucks. But and it's funny you actually brought that up about South Korea because I had a friend that visited China about a few years ago. I think it must have been 2019. But one of the things he mentioned to me was just like how pretty much everyone he saw was always looking down at their phone constantly. He went to like a nightclub and everyone was just sitting on their phone the entire time. So it's interesting, like you said, to see over the next like 5, 10, 20 years how things are going to change. And we can sort of see the dots connecting already, but it's only going to get more exacerbated.
Yeah, and we see that, right? Well, it's funny because a lot of those areas over there in Asia, like, are these like hot spots for longevity, but that's like the most backward looking way to evaluate the health of a society ever. And we've already seen like Okinawa, Japan drop off a cliff. I mean, Singapore, Hong Kong are also like quote unquote longevity hotspots. You look how built up
I
they
mean,
are.
actually, what I was going to say is like when you look at like the graphs of lifespan longevity and stuff like that, it had been for a long time. You'd see populations stay living longer in cities, and now we will see that decline. I would
Yeah, well,
imagine.
now that
Um,
childbirth and infant mortality is kind of completely out of the picture in terms of the past few decades, and the chronic exposure to toxins and disconnection from nature and innate biological inputs. It's only going to drop, and you're seeing that right with the fertility issues. So that's kind of like the first sign, I think, and it's scary. And that's why we do what we do, because you really need to take a decentralized lens for this, or else nobody's going to be looking out for you, and you're just
so that sort of
yeah.
begs the question, like, how should we be using technology to avoid like some of these effects? And like, there's we're going to be interviewing the guy tomorrow about the blue light computer, or
Daylight.
the not blue light computer. Yeah, yeah, that stuff will be amazing.
Yeah.
Um,
So I'm excited about that. How we should be using technology. Again, I mentioned a few things, right? Like right now, I got my internet like hardwired. I'm using wired headphones,
and I
distance.
have no internet right now, so that's great.
Well, you're using LTE, which I think is probably worse than Wi-Fi, to be honest. But I guess it's now 5G. So yeah, 5G, you can just turn it off. Like, turn your receiver off. Don't turn that on. Like, get out of the city. Don't hang out in highly densely populated areas all the time. Avoid that as much as you can. Yeah, use turn off your Wi-Fi at night. We talked about the importance of sleep, or you mentioned that at the beginning, right? If you can't restore and repair from the toxins of daily exposure, you are fucked, and you are fighting a losing battle every day. I mean, just think of it as a battle. Every single day, you're going out there and you're getting attacked by toxins, blue light, EMFs, glyphosate, plastics, whatever. And you could rank those and how bad they are for your health. It doesn't really matter. What matters is how you repair at nighttime via melatonin regulating autophagy and apoptosis in your body. And if you do that, you're going to be able to last a lot longer and fight off aging. But if you have the Wi-Fi on at night, if you have your phone next to your head, if you have light disruption, sound disruption, and you're not sleeping well, you're not going to repair. So the sleep is so tremendously important, and that's why everyone should prioritize creating a sleep sanctuary. Because I can't tell you what to do during the day if you actually have a job that you have to go to support your family. Yes, you could become an entrepreneur and work from home and all that, but it's not really realistic to tell people to do that right now. But what you can do right now is create a sleep sanctuary. Get your bedrooms tested, buy an EMF meter, buy a body voltage kit, turn off the power if you can, turn off the Wi-Fi and your cell phones for sure, and turn off all the lights at night, block blue light at night. That's going to be really important. So I think that's the most important thing, to be honest. And in terms of how you use technology, like I said, if you can hardwire your internet, that's fantastic. That's what I've done recently. If you can use wired headphones, if you can just have distance, never hold this stuff up next to your brain, next to your heart, never carry it in your pocket. If you're a man or a woman, you're carrying it in your front pocket or your breast. It's just like so silly and such a problem. And the distance is extremely important. So inverse square law is our best friend. And I think just understanding those kind of small things, unplugging your appliances when you're not using them, just becoming cognizant of your EMF environment doesn't mean you need to be neurotic and stress out like every time you go in like a grocery store or wherever you go during the day, but just understand that there are small things you can do to probably reduce your exposure by like 70 to 90%. And that's a big deal, right? So if you do that and couple that with obviously prioritizing mitochondrial, circadian, quantum health, all these things, going outside, getting connected to nature, you're going to be doing the best you can in your situation. So I think that's really important. And that's kind of what you have to do in a modern toxic world to stay afloat.
Totally agree. I couldn't have said it better. I mean, like the sleep thing's huge. You can gauge so much about a person by asking them how well they sleep. Like I could probably tell you almost everything wrong with them just by asking them that question. And if they can't sleep, then I know that this stuff is immediately an issue.
Yeah. And it starts the second you wake up in the morning. What are you doing? Go outside, get some sunlight in your eyes, watch a sunrise, and just understand the signals. They're all input signals to our biology. Light, food, temperature, probably the biggest ones. And if you want to optimize the outputs, you have to fix the inputs. And it's that simple.
Yep.
And I say it on every podcast that I go on. It's nice to have that, system level perspective as an engineer, but really that's what it's all about. And we've distorted our inputs. We've distorted our connection to source of energy, the earth, the sun, food that's real. And now we're paying the price from a societal perspective in terms of health. And the big pharma healthcare model doesn't really care about that. So they're just going to keep you sick. And that's where we are. So it's a fun time, but there are things you can do. So EMFs, just going to keep sounding the horn on this. And I'm really excited. Hopefully I've reached out to some of these researchers. We can get them on the show and kind of just go through it even more. But that's what we need to keep prioritizing.
100%. Should we open for like some questions and stuff like that?
Yeah, let's do it. On the Twitter space. If you guys want to ask a question, or we could go through the questions that someone already asked.
Yeah, let's do that
Let's
first
do
and
that
then maybe
first
open it up.
Open up. Let's see.
Let's see if I can find
Best light bulbs you'd recommend, incandescent and reds, anything else you might suggest, especially for travel purposes. Yeah, your lighting environment is huge. The only really light bulbs I'd turn on in my house are red light bulbs at nighttime. So I would say first trying to prioritize opening windows and things like that can be a challenge in the winter, but I even crack my windows here when it's like 30 degrees out. Worth it to me. Incandescents are great. Yeah. People always ask me where you can buy them. The ones on Amazon, Walmart actually look sketchy. I don't even know if they're real incandescents. I would say go on Facebook Marketplace or just, find someone who's had incandescents for a while if you want to use that. There's some few lighting companies out there that are making like full spectrum bulbs. Some of them like transition throughout the day. Some of them are kind of just like daylight use. Obviously, after the sun goes down, you want as low of brightness and kind of just little light as you possibly can. So getting something very dark red, very dim. You don't want to use a 300-watt red light therapy device after the sun goes down, FYI. But yeah, there's some cool. So Scott Zimmerman has a company. I forget what it's called. You could just Google Scott Zimmerman. He's the one doing a lot of this great research with Russell Ryder on near infrared light, melatonin as well, synthesis in the mitochondria. That's all fascinating. Block blue light has a full spectrum light bulb, I think, and then incandescents and red light bulbs from. There's a bunch of red light bulb places you can get. Midwest Therapy has cheap ones. Travel purposes, yeah, you can bring that stuff with you. Screw-in light bulbs are pretty travel friendly.
That's what I do.
Yeah. Or
Yeah, I
buy
was
a
doing like,
headlamp too, like a red, those like backpacking red
oh yeah,
LED headlamps. I have a couple of those.
yeah.
Those are good for at nighttime and pretty dim. Other non-obvious best practices for minimizing harmful EMF effects. Non-obvious. Ryan, you have any non-obvious EMF tips that I haven't mentioned?
I'm kind of an obvious guy. I go for the obvious stuff. So it'd have to hit me out of left field, but not really. I mean, a lot of it's kind of, I mean, I think like you said, the biggest thing, which might not be obvious unless you kind of dig into stuff, would be like in your sleep sanctuary, your room, thinking about the outlets around where you sleep. And so that's why having something like from EMF Safe to like turn the breakers off into your room would be super beneficial because you're still getting that stuff from the outlets around your room. And I think another not obvious one would be like unplugging things, like say in your kitchen or just in general, because when you plug in or like I don't know, this one seems obvious to me, but maybe it would be non-obvious to like someone that doesn't know anything about it. It's just like having my laptop plugged into the wall with a two-prong non-grounded thing, like that's just like exacerbating it as well. So those are kind of my top of mind quote non-obvious
No,
ones. Seem pretty obvious to me, but
no, those are spot on. That's actually really good. That's actually this other guy's question in the feed. He asked that.
oh, about the two
Yeah,
prong, yeah,
and yeah, people don't understand that if your plug is not grounded, you're radiating an electric field like 6 to 8 feet outwards. So if you
yeah, that's
like all
wild.
Macs, all Apples, all products, they're all ungrounded plugs. That's a good thing, I guess, about PC is like the HP I have, it's grounded. Test your outlets, make sure they're grounded, and then yeah, just unplug that stuff, especially in your bedroom. I don't want to buy an EMF safe breaker switch, so I just have the power going to my bedrooms. Luckily, it's on a specific circuit. It's just off. Like there's no power in my bedroom.
That's
It's just
smart.
off
Yeah,
all
that's
the
smart.
time. There's still
I
some
guess actually,
residual, even measuring my body voltage in my bedroom with everything off. I'm still reading like 200, 300 millivolts because there's other circuits on in the house. So
what was it before?
like 1.5 volts, like like 20 50x that. It's
Yeah,
insane. So and
yeah,
that's where you can get into the whole grounding thing, right? Like, do you really want to be grounding 2 volts through your body? Probably not.
yeah,
So that's
yeah.
we don't have to talk about that, but it's
No,
a
actually, I
debate.
thought of another one. That you, well, I mean, you tweeted about it the other day, but it was like installing like one of those timers on your outlets. So like for your Wi-Fi, just
Oh
if you
yeah.
can't quote turn it off because of somebody else, set it on a timer and you'll get it. It'll at least be off for a couple hours in the middle of the night. You know what I mean?
Yeah, people always ask me, Tristan, I live in an apartment or I have roommates. Like, what should I do? Well, first off, any reduction in exposure is a benefit, right? Like any reduction, even if it's 5%, might as well take it. So if you have roommates, and this is something I wish I did because I had roommates that would stay up till midnight or 1 a.m. or get home late. Buy an outlet timer. They cost $10 at the hardware store. My dad was using them, 20 years ago for our vacations when we would leave the country. And they're perfect. You can just set them, they're manual timers, and you can set them to only have the outlet off from like midnight to 5 a.m. So at least you have 5 hours of reduction of exposure. And obviously from there, you can try and just, get new roommates or, live by yourself. But it's, again, not realistic for everybody. So that's why the Wi-Fi
Yeah.
or the outlet timers. And they also have these remote control outlet buttons you can buy. That Tech Wellness site is pretty good. That's where I bought a lot of my adapters.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're lazy and don't want to physically unplug the Wi-Fi, or it's in kind of a weird spot like behind a bunch of furniture, you can buy an outlet that's controlled by a remote, and you just press a button. So that's something you do. But yeah, if you're willing to spend the money, I think the EMF, or if you live in a house that like you're going to live in for 5 to 10 years, check out EMF Safe, because that circuit breaker switch is probably the best thing that you could do to reduce your exposure at home. And then, yeah, I mean, just keep your phone on airplane mode. Something that's non-obvious, I would say, is cell phone radiation when you have poor signal. So when you have a weak signal, like 1 bar or 2 bar, your cell phone, or you're in your car and you're in like a semi-Faraday cage, that signal is going to be boosted up 5, 10, 100. I've seen
Oh, wow.
Some people even say 1,000 to 10,000 times stronger just to get out, just to get to that cell phone tower to transmit the signal. So that's something to be aware of. If you're in really low service areas, like especially if you're driving, for example, I'm driving through Wyoming, 80% of the trip is 1 bar. My phone's on airplane mode or off because I don't want to have, or my windows are completely down or semi down to break the Faraday cage a little more. So I would say that's some non-obvious tips. And yeah, cars in general could definitely be EMF bombs, especially if you bring the EMFs inside of them and trap them in there.
Yeah, that's a good one because it's roaming. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I think that's it for the questions on the feed. So we can open it up to anybody who wants a question or just come on and chat. I see there's a few comments in here. Yeah. So there's a few comments. Incandescents are also on eBay. That's good. Have some countries banned 5G because of health concerns? I don't think anyone has banned it, but I know that the US, China, and Japan have rolled it out and are rolling it out faster than anywhere else. If you want to compare countries in terms of safety limits of EMFs, Eastern Europe and Russia actually have the most stringent EMF limits, sometimes 100 to 1,000 times lower than the US. The Soviets were actually the ones who pioneered a lot of the EMF research. So if you go back and read like Becker's book or Marino's book, they talk about this at length. So
and that's actually a really good point because we had talked about that in a previous live. I think where we're just talking about 5G, but like the limits on what they allow, like for RF, is like drastically different from country to country.
Yeah, and it's really bad. And there's again, you go look at Dr. Henry Lai's research studies. He'll show you hundreds of studies at like 5 to 10% of the safety limits showing harmful biological effects. So in reality, the limits are supposed to be like 1/100th or 1/1000th of the exposure, or the lowest exposure threshold. So they really should be like 100,000 times lower than they are. That's canopies. I don't know if that's like the Faraday cage canopy bed. I would not want to sleep in a Faraday cage. I don't recommend that.
That was something we sort of discussed because I had listened to a few
someone
podcasts
asked
talking
about
about
paint
creating
as
a
well.
Faraday cage.
Yeah. If you paint your bedroom or you just create a Faraday cage, especially if you paint the walls, you're just creating a cage for everything to be trapped in there. And then, you're blocking everything else. So I don't think it's a good idea. If you live right near a tower and you kind of calculated with an EMF consultant the angle of incidence and wanted to paint like one sliver of your wall, that maybe could be a good idea. But yeah, I wouldn't buy Faraday paint or be bullish on Faraday paint. Faraday cages in general are very controversial. The Faraday clothing as well. I don't know how that works. It's not even a complete Faraday cage. Any sort of case, right? It's all, again, once you break the Faraday cage, it's just going to be reflective and perhaps even multiplying the EMF back into a different place.
That's what I've always wondered with like the EMF clothing and stuff, because it's not closed, like your head's sticking out of it, your arms are sticking out of it. It's like, is it just shuffling it up and down?
Yeah, perhaps.
And actually making it worse.
But if you're infertile and you're going on an airplane and you wear like silver lined underwear, that might be better to push it to like your calf than your balls. I don't know. We just don't know. And these companies will like sell you this material at a very expensive price, and it's kind of just highly controversial. So I think that's all the questions from the chat. So if anyone wants to come up and chat or ask a question, see, Jack, you're still on the line. If you want to come up and chat, we're happy to discuss as well. Someone requested Mother Nature. Bitcoin Pomsey. What a name. That might be the best username I've ever heard.
Well, it's Jack Kruse. So.
Oh, there we go. Oh, it's your.
I'm actually on one of my family members' phones because my phone doesn't do Twitter Spaces because I have an iPhone that's too old.
Oh, sorry. I would have approved your request there a lot earlier on if I had noticed you.
Yeah, well, I sent you a DM. I told you that I would probably do that. that I'd be on here. So I'll just, if somebody has a question or you guys want to talk about something, we can go that route. I've been listening in and kind of heard some of the stuff you said. I've answered some of the questions of the people in chat, about, countries that have banned 5G. Yeah, they've knocked out the ZTE parts of China. They blamed a lot of it on security issues, but believe it or not, some of that's tied to health issues as well. You guys talked about the 60 gigahertz band. Just want to make sure everybody knows, because I didn't do a great job of explaining that in your podcast, because we covered it so fast and went through it.
Yeah.
Many people don't know that microwave ovens work best at 2.5 gigahertz. And the reason for that, there's three specific frequencies we should talk about. 900 megahertz, the 2.4 gigahertz bands, and then the 60 gigahertz bands that you guys were talking about. The reason why they're problematic is different. The 900 and 2.4 bands, which is where Wi-Fi works, is because of water absorption. So what does that mean? It means that those frequency bands are useless to carriers because the signals are attenuated. Now the 60 gigahertz band is useless to carriers because oxygen absorbs it. So you have to realize that, like Verizon, AT&T, etc., paid a lot of money at auctions for these, but they don't use it. And if you look at the 600 gigahertz band, it's actually license free for Wi-Fi. Why? Because oxygen attenuates it. Now, what the key is that none of these guys covered, and what I tried to tell you guys in the podcast, is that people don't realize what happens in the troposphere with oxygen when you've got EMF in the atmosphere. It's the ozone reaction. And when the ozone reaction is fucked with, it changes the frequency spectrum of terrestrial sunlight. That's the key. And the key is when you have spectroscopes in cities that have high 5G penetrance, what you'll find is the quantum yield, or the spectrum that comes from the sun down to the earth, is altered. And it's altered because of the absorption frequency. So what's the ultimate effect? At the mitochondrial levels, it causes pseudohypoxia. Pseudohypoxia means NAD positive is down. And generally when NAD positive is down, it means hydrogen's not recycling through the mitochondria. That's the ultimate effect. Now, of course, there's tons of other things, but if you think about it, anything that makes you hypoxic generally is not a good thing. And what a lot of people really don't know, the reason why it's really a problem is hypoxia links to HIF1, which links to BMAL, which is one of the positive circadian regulators. So when you guys were mentioning before, if you have problems sleeping, this and that, this is ultimately the pathway that is initially affected. And then when you get hypoxia then breaks down melanin sheets inside your body. And when melanin begins to get broken down, then you have pathway destruction. So, for example, I wrote a blog called Quantum Engineering 47, and I told people there that anybody who has a sleep disturbance has a problem with their dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. And I laid out the whole pathway where the melanin would come from an embryologic basis, so people would understand how this stuff works. And it's not that this pathway is just affected by the interaction with EMF in your say Chicago, LA, or New York. It can happen from a variety of different ways, and most people don't realize when you have poor sleep, whether it's insomnia, whether it's a sleep wave disorder, whether it's like I don't know, restless leg syndrome, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't matter what the disease is. The defect is in melanin at that level. In other words, you can't create those 4 electrons and you're only working on 2. So it means that electrical circuit in the brain isn't as good as it used to be. And that's kind of how you go from the macroscopic 60 or 80,000 foot view down to the cell level and understand how it changes charge density. of things in us. And unfortunately, like I said, we didn't get into the details of it. Some of the researchers that you guys mentioned earlier have written papers on all these detailed spots. Like Henry Lay has done some great work. Martin Paul's done some great stuff. You know, the guys that we talked about in the podcast, like Abe Liboff, that did the original studies on calcium ion frequency in 1970. All these things link together, and it's complex if you don't know the science. But I can promise you, there's so much that's published that it's absolutely accurate to say that non-native EMF has a huge effect, even though it's not ionized radiation. And when you think about how our governments, you know, make laws and the way the FCC law in '96 was made, it's an absolute fucking joke, you know, when you know the science.
Yeah, that I mean, those are great points, and I think that's something that I was reading more into these plots, right, of the water vapor and the oxygen absorption or attenuation, really is I guess the better term of these frequencies. And yeah, that peak at 60 hertz, but if you layer them on top of each other, I think there's one at 24 gigahertz with water vapor. So I guess the question is really, Jack, is they're not really using 60 gigahertz yet. I mean, maybe they are in like some, they're using
No, they
70.
won't. I don't think they ever will, because if you look at the auction data, right now, 60 gigahertz is Wi-Fi free. You don't need, and
Yeah,
you don't
it's
need a license.
unlicensed, right? Like anybody
Right.
could
You don't.
technically use it.
Right. Anybody can use it, and the same thing is true at 120. The same thing is true because if you look at oxygen, it's got a spike at 24. It's got a spike at 60. A spike at 120.
Mm-hmm.
Another spike at like 180, and then another spike up higher between 300 and 400. Those are the bands where it's attenuated, but that story is not a story that people realize. That's a story in the atmosphere that's affecting with ozone. And what people don't realize, ozone ties directly to the amount of UV that's getting through and changing the spectrum. And that's one of the real problems. Because remember, people don't understand the UV spectrum at all. And this is the exogenous part of the story. That I didn't really spend a lot of time talking either to you, Vern, about or you guys about. The exogenous part is important for surface level melanin, for topologic effects. The stuff that we make inside of us, that's a real total different ballgame. But if anybody thinks that EMF doesn't affect the surfaces of your body, you're wrong. It does. And that's the reason why, you can live at LA at the 33rd latitude and go out every day, at Venice Beach and get tan, but then you check your vitamin D level and you'll notice that it's 35 or 28. And you'll be like, how the fuck is this possible? Because there's changes of terrestrial frequencies by our use of EMFs. And no one is walking around 5G cities with spectroscopes, but they should. In fact, in my opinion, public health measures should have accurate measurement of the effective quantum yield of every city, and those should be posted on a website so that people know, what places are better to live than not for exogenous sunlight. Because just knowing what the terrestrial spectrum is of the sun naturally isn't good enough. You need to know what it is in your zip code to make appropriate changes. And this is fundamentally the reason why we see, different disease metrics in different zip codes, in ICD-9 and ICD-10 data from hospitals. We see it not only in the United States, but we see it in other parts of the world. And people are not making these connections, from the light environment to disease metrics, but yet it's really, really important. And I like to mention this, I like to give people the easy softball stuff when I talk about the complex science. This is the reason why black people at high latitudes got COVID more than white people at that level. This is the reason why black people had a much higher kill rate in places like Boston, New York, and Minnesota. This wasn't a racial statement. This is actually a quantum yield statement because they have a different Fitzpatrick score in their skin, than other people. And coronaviruses got their name because they wax and wane with the terrestrial frequency. So the link to COVID isn't, I don't want to say that it's like some of the conspiracy theories that you guys were talking about earlier, but the link is strong. And it's very well known that when you have decreased quantum yield exogenously, coronaviruses take off. So anything that alters the terrestrial spectrum is going to make just about any coronavirus, including the ones that are made, in a lab, and even some of the natural viruses out there are going to have an issue with that. I mean, to give you one that I think most people have had experiences with is probably herpes virus and chickenpox, for the same reasons. That's the reason why some people say, well, yeah, I go out in the sun, and they blame the sun, but they don't realize the sun that they're out in is altered spectrum sunlight. And that's actually the real reason that the virus gets activated in the dermatome, that it's infected in the central nervous system.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So is this like a hyper local effect in terms of the 5G like altering the sunlight spectrum over cities, or what's, I guess, the radius really we think of this effect? Because yeah, I mean that's even another reason why you should get the hell out of the city, I would say.
Well, it's more complex than that. I mean, we like to try to make this simple, like for clinicians and patients. Everybody knows that vitamin D is 312 to 320 nanometer light, which is firmly UVB. But people forget that nitric oxide is made from UVA light,
Mm-hmm.
and both of those chemicals act as proxies. So, like for example, if you live, and I'm just picking on LA right now, just because I don't want any of my people to live in LA, but I want people in LA to know why certain diseases are showing up there much more frequently. For example, LA, Southern California has huge problems with long COVID. The reason for that is these people cannot make the appropriate amount of vitamin D or nitric oxide. So even when they're in the sun, they're not developing appropriate melanin, and this is causing mitochondrial, how shall we say, reduced redox. It shouldn't be like that, because if you go to the 33rd latitude, say in other parts of the world, like for example, the Med, any place on the Med in Europe, Southern Med is right around the same frequency. They don't have the same disease metrics, but remember that the population density in those cities and the quantum yield in those cities are also radically different than what's happening in California. And those are the things that people need to pay attention to. So, like, I try to always make these arguments in podcasts, but to be honest with you, I don't know if people stack the lessons. New Orleans is at the 28th latitude, but so is the Pyramid of Giza. Look at the Pyramid of Giza. It's sitting in the middle of a fucking Sahara desert, and New Orleans basically in a tropical rainforest. Um, you need to realize that just understanding latitude is not equivalent to understanding terrestrial sunlight at that specific location. That's really, really important. And I don't think people really get that level of sophistication. And you need to, because when you live in a city, like for example, say you live in a city, I'm just going to give you a, for example, right off the top of my head, say somewhere in Virginia that's surrounded by trees. The trees are going to change the terrestrial spectrum of what you would experience, say, compared to Las Vegas. Even if the latitude was exactly the same, people don't realize that. They don't realize that the effect can be good, bad, or indifferent. But when you add EMF to the mix, and because the EMF that can be made in a wooded area is radically different than the EMF that can be made, say, west of the Mississippi, because there is no trees. There's not a lot of water. There's a lot of, desert terrain. It's a totally different, ball game. And then you have to realize then the effect of altitude is present. So when you go to, say, I don't know, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, versus, say, some of the mid-Atlantic states like New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, even though their latitudes are similar, the terrestrial footprint is radically different, and you actually see these metrics change in hospital ICU data. And the problem is nobody is making the link between hospital ICU data and zip codes. But I guarantee you, every public health official in the United States, if they measured this, they would see this effect. I've actually mentioned to several of my pathologist friends that they should start doing this with COVID deaths that they thought was bullshit. And you would probably see a very interesting 3D map develop where it'd actually be very, very interesting from a public health standpoint. Obviously, the United States is varied. This is a political hot potato, and it's also an ideological problem. But, one of the things that I'm aiming to do is actually this very project in El Salvador. Why? Because El Salvador is the size of South Carolina. El Salvador also has a really interesting topology where, we have mountains in different places and then we don't have mountains in others. And I've actually mentioned to people in the government down here that I think that the effect of long COVID, myocarditis, and the turbo cancers are going to be radically different here than the experience that we're going to see, say, in Detroit, then we're going to see in Edmonton, then we're going to see in London, then we're going to see, say, in the Middle East. It's not just about people that took 4, 5, 6 boosters. It's actually tied to how much sun power that they're able to generate at their zip code. And people forget when we talk non-native EMF, you need to also understand that EMF from the sun is what we're designed to operate with. So if you subtract from the original power source effectively, that also becomes an EMF. It doesn't have to be generated from a man-made tower to cause disease.
Yeah, so it's almost like this equation of what's the source EMF that's obviously positive for us, and then you're subtracting out I guess the terrestrial interference, and then also the non-native EMF exposure. And yeah, it makes a ton of sense, and it just goes back to kind of the locality being extremely important to your health, and that should also be something everyone considers from just a seasonality and environment perspective of embracing where they are. And for me right now, that's getting cold and getting outside as much as possible in the winter in Wyoming, and I feel pretty damn good. But I'm also at 5,000 feet. When I'm in water, I'm getting UVA reflection, so I'm getting more. And these are all things off the snow as well. So yeah, there's a lot of things that alter the light environment, and that'd be some cool data epidemiologically to look at kind of the solar yield and spectrum by geography. But I doubt we'll get that anytime soon. All right. Well, maybe we can open it up to questions for people. So if you have a question in the chat or want to come up and ask us or Jack question, I will approve you one by one here. So eat some seaweed. The floor is yours when you unmute yourself.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Sweet. I just want to thank you all for doing this work, Dr. Kruse and the decentralized team. This is important stuff. I just want to make a comment and then one quick question, and I'll just drop off. One of the things I've noticed is even though testosterone levels in men are dropping, I'm noticing like a lot of guys are getting bald. I don't know if people are balding sooner, and this might be one of the reasons why, among with many other reasons. But I was also wondering, is there any correlation between all of this stuff and Bluetooth use, and maybe how Bluetooth damages the body too? And if you've spoken on this already, you can disregard. Thank you.
You guys are going to take that, or you want me to answer it?
I mean, I could start it and then hand it off to you. I think for sure it has an effect, right? Blue light, artificial light, lack of red, near infrared light. Definitely. I mean, there's so many studies on red and infrared light on hair growth, right? So if we're disconnected, and the hair is not really that important from survival perspective, so it's probably going to be the first thing to go when you have some mitochondrial dysfunction, I would say. And the 2.4 gigahertz Bluetooth would imagine also has some effect as well. But yeah, Jack, if you want to add anything to that.
Well, this is an interesting question that a lot of people flub. Classically, high testosterone leads to hair loss. That's what it used to be, but in a world that's modern, lit with RF and microwaves, uh, baldness now is a different ball game. Actually, it's actually a circadian mechanism. That's why most guys are going bald early. It's actually not from high testosterone because most of their testosterone is low. So
Yeah.
this is really an interesting conundrum because guys have low testosterone from EMF because you get pregnenolone and steal syndrome. For those of you who don't know what that is, all sex steroid hormones are made from LDL cholesterol, but to make it, you have to have free T3 and you have to have also vitamin A. If you don't have those things appropriately quantized, you cannot make the appropriate amount of testosterone, DHEA, estrogen, or progesterone. So that's the real reason why the low testosterone exists. But the reason why your hair falls out at the same time isn't because of the testosterone being low or high. It's because the non-native EMF actually activates the circadian mechanism in the hair follicle so that it ages at a much faster rate. And that's the reason why it happens.
Bam. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I definitely, think the testosterone point is pretty valid. So,
Well, I was just going to add too. One thing I've noticed is like obviously like premature graying and stuff like that as well. But one thing I've noticed as well is like in women specifically is like people going into menopause earlier and earlier. Like this happened to my boss's wife very recently, who's just like 40 years old, is going into perimenopause already,
I
or like
guarantee you,
even earlier.
she had her period way earlier too. See, that's the other
Yeah.
part of
yep.
this. You need to realize girls are now having precocious puberty, at 6, 7 years old. And that's the effect of blue light and non-native EMF. So that means they're never going to make it, to what we normally would see was between 50 and 55 years old, where most, humans go into menopause. Now it's happening sometimes at 35, 40 years old. So that's why I'm trying to explain to you guys, even the hair graying thing is
Yeah.
actually tied to the circadian issue with melanin loss and things
Hmm.
being sped up. And the thing is, things don't make sense now because the things that we've associated in the past, in endocrinology books, no longer are operational because you have two different axes working at the same time, sometimes providing clinical symptoms that don't make any sense from a classical endocrinology sense until you realize functionally what's happening, that you're destroying the hormone panel while you're speeding up their circadian clock mechanism.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, we're seeing basically everything happen earlier and earlier, and it's interesting to watch centralized medicine tackle it, only because they're sort of ignoring everything that's causing it.
Yeah. I mean, that's mitochondrial DNA mutations and heteroplasmy right there. All right, Tim, we can let you up here and ask a question.
What's up, fellas? How you doing?
Good.
Fantastic.
This question could be for you guys or for Jack. Basically, I was just wondering, Tristan, I know I've heard you talk about this. Do you think it's possible that we could achieve optimal hydration solely through the production of metabolic water by eating enough fat, and while drinking like very little of the liquid form of water?
Yeah,
Just
I mean, yeah, I guess that's very important. Is what's more important is the water your mitochondria produces compared to the water you're drinking in terms of cellular hydration, and then also the fact that fat does produce far more water and deuterium depleted water in the mitochondria compared to glucose. So yeah, if that kind of sort of answers it.
Yeah, I mean, I know that when we're drinking the liquid form of water, I mean, aren't we ultimately depleting our own metabolic water and just peeing it out when we do that?
No,
No?
no, you've been. Listen, there's a lot of misinformation in the space. I'll tell you where it mostly comes from. The guys in Los Angeles that are trying to sell people deuterium depleted water,
Yep.
and you just need to understand, that when people have a business, you need to be very careful about the things that they tell you and the things they vet. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm not going to try to be a dick about this
Sure.
because I like the guy a lot. Dr. Boros, came to an event that I invited him to in Vermont and basically told everybody that he drank olive oil. He didn't drink water because he felt it was better for creating metabolic water. And I just sat there and I listened to it. I didn't say anything to him because I'd already had a previous talk with him, and he told me, that he also had prostate cancer. And I finally said, how do you square these two things? And he can't. And the problem is when you have a good marketing story that doesn't match up to the science, you have a duty to tell people the fucking truth. Okay.
Right.
And the water that you drink really isn't that important. I'm going to tell you when it is important. It's important when you have a significant mitochondrial disease. So here's the good side of Dr. Boris, the side that I really like. He has highlighted the work of Gabor Somali on cancer patients. That's when deuterium depleted water really makes a difference. But if you have a redox between negative 200 and negative 400, spending money on fucking deuterium depleted water is like going to buy Dave Asprey's supplements.
Right. Yeah. No, I've heard him talk about that. I actually talked to him in the summer. I just noticed personally, anecdotally, Jack, that like whenever I eat like a meal that has like either like a lot of ghee or coconut oil, and then I'm out in the sun, like I can literally feel my skin get like very hydrated. Like it gets much softer. Like I'll just notice changes quickly. And then I notice sometimes like,
But realize what you just said. You were
yeah,
out in the sun, so you just built up your solar redox.
Yeah.
right.
Solar redox actually creates the water.
Yep.
It's not the water that creates it. And the water doesn't have the feedback loop. And the reason for that, and I want to make sure you understand this because it's a great question you bring up.
Yep.
When we drink water, there's two compartments. There's an intra and extracellular compartment.
Yep.
Drinking water only affects one of those compartments. So to have the effect that, Boris has led people to believe, the effect has to be equivalent in both places, and it's not. Now, there's a third compartment of water that Boris has done a great job with. That's the mitochondrial cytoplasm versus the matrix. And the matrix water is incredibly important for how the TCA cycle works. Just realize those four different compartments that I told you about,
Mm-hmm.
they're none of them are connected one to one. In fact, they're all stochastic and they operate in a totally different way. So I don't want you to ever think that drinking water is going to have an equivalent amount on any one of those water compartments in your body because that's not true.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks, you guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's important. And yeah, we had Boros on the show, and he didn't talk about water really at all in terms of drinking it, which I was happy about. He just focused on, the grass fed, pasture raised meats and things like that. But the other thing as well, Jack, is that we can deplete deuterium naturally through just sun exposure, right?
Yep.
So that's kind of something that's
Well,
maybe under discussed in
yeah,
that
and
water
that's
selling space.
Tristan, I was going to tell you, that's what I try to bring up to the questioner that was just on your stage,
Yeah.
that's what I want people to focus in on because guess what? Sunlight affects all four compartments. Drinking water only affects one out of the four compartments. Okay? The reason why it's more effective in cancer patients is because when you drink the water, because of problems with your uncoupling proteins in mitochondria, that's when it can affect other compartments. So you have to have those leaky gates in order for the water to make a big effect. And most people don't have that problem.
Yeah, so you're saying if you do have issues already with mitochondrial dysfunction, that you might be kind of leaking via it's uncoupling protein 2, right? That is kind of regulating some of the deuterium, I guess, inflow or outflow in the mitochondria.
You just sounded like a robot to me, dude. I couldn't hear anything.
Oh, I don't know if that was me, but I was just. Can you hear me now, Ryan? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay.
I can hear you. I can hear you now.
Yeah, I was just saying it sounds like, that for people who have compromised health is just a completely different story than people who do have, sufficient mitochondrial function.
That's totally true. And that is the message that needs to get out. And I don't think that Boros is a bad guy. I really don't. I think he's actually a good guy. But several of the people that he's gone into business with, they're businessmen. And
Yeah.
you guys know how I feel about businessmen. Their needs come before the patient's needs. And when it comes to a guy like me, all I give a fuck about is telling people the truth about how health and disease work. Because remember, I took an oath. I have skin in that game. They don't.
Yeah.
Jack, do you have a specific blog with just information about those 4 compartments that you were talking about? Just because I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, I do. I'd have to go back and look at it, but it's probably in the quantum thermodynamics sets of blogs on Patreon.
Okay.
I did a pretty good job laying out all those different compartments. I've actually done webinars on it. I've done webinars on cancer and actually how the UCP2 gate is the big offender in cancer, and why deuterium depleted water makes sense in those cases.
Right.
So you could look through that. The Patreon blogs, dude, I know they're heavy science, but they're all cited heavily with research papers. I promise you, this stuff is stuff that I covered years ago, probably 5 to 7 years ago.
Yeah. Okay. Because I just became a Patreon member probably 4 or 5 months ago. So I kind of started with the later ones, and then I'm going back. So I'll definitely look for that. Thanks a lot for your answers, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tim. If anyone else wants to come up, ask a question, or I don't know if there's any update in the chat or responses. Someone talked about CPAP machines. Yeah, that's definitely a concern. Yeah.
Not too much.
Yeah, Jack, something as well as 6G, right? We get into this terahertz realm, and I think that's even where the oxygen and water absorption in the atmosphere is even higher, right? From the papers, the graphs I have read from the DoD.
Yeah, I wrote a blog on LinkedIn that anybody can find. It's about the terahertz. Scary shit. I mean, and now there's places that want to go into that. The leader right now in the space is actually China for 6G.
Yeah.
But don't think the United States is far behind, because what the NRO is doing with satellites, if you knew what was really going on in the Department of Defense, you'd be mortified, because Space Force is not going to be kind to biologic health.
Yeah, just looking at some of these plots and knowing, obviously, the electromagnetic interference of those frequencies is. I've almost been happy that 5G rollout has taken a lot longer than I think they've anticipated. So hopefully 6G is still a decade away at least. But yeah, maybe something will happen kind of from now until then to sway the difference. But I know the military is always 10 to 15 years ahead, and they're already using millimeter waves for crowd control. There's millimeter waves in your cruise control in new cars as well. So I actually stopped using cruise control on my Forerunner. But and then the next wave of smart and autonomous vehicles is just insane how much content they want to have in there from an EMF perspective. So it's important to get ahead of the curve on this, folks, because it's only going to be exponentially increasing, I think. All right. Ryan,
Cool.
You got anything else to add, or anyone else have any questions?
Nah, man, that was good. Make sure to get Sunrise tomorrow. Everyone here better do it.
Better do it or you're banned forever.
Yep.
But thanks for coming on, Jack. Sorry you weren't on the speaker for the first part there, but yeah, I appreciate your time.
No problem. Anytime, guys.
You have a good one. Everyone, thanks for tuning in. And yeah, follow us more on Decentralized Radio to catch your podcast episodes. Oh, Anthony has a question.
Oh, cool.
We'll let him up real quick. Anthony. Yeah, I got you. We can squeeze you in here.
I was wondering, just a slightly different direction with this. I was wondering, beside scientific research and education, how else have you guys been having success communicating this information with your family and friends?
With my family and friends. Well, that's
I can tell you. Honestly, it's really funny. Over the last year, I feel like I've had a lot more success with the people closest to me, but it's come from unfortunate circumstance, which seems to be the theme of a lot of people's stories. Is like some shit happens, you get diagnosed with XYZ, and then you start asking the crazy black sheep kid in the family who's doing all this weird sun stuff what to do about it, because now all of a sudden it's a serious matter. And that's sort of like been my experience. Unfortunately, I haven't been the people I'm closest to, like with my brother and stuff, haven't had too much success at all. In fact, maybe it's gone backwards. But it seems to be difficult to reach people that don't have some sort of issue. But that just seems to be the theme. I don't know about with you, Tristan. I know you bought red lights for everybody.
Yeah, it's kind of hard, right? I mean, my sister, my family's kind of, they have their particular things. Like my sister, for some reason, just always unplugs appliances, and I'm like, oh, nice, that's great from like an EMF perspective. She's like, yeah, I don't want to burn down my house. So it's like you take your small wins. My dad, he works for the government as an electrical engineer, but is like used to like hardwired internet. So he's like happy to use hardwired internet, and also understands that like Bluetooth is probably not great to put next to your head. So there's been kind of like easy moments to like capture them. And my mom is very open to health. But outside of that, friends, kind of, I guess you would say normie friends. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, right? And it's almost like how I feel about talking to people about Bitcoin, because there's a certain point where you kind of just like give up, and you just like try and lead by example. You try and, send them information, but at a certain point, you kind of just have to let them find it on their own, because that's just how the world works. And that's the unfortunate reality. All you can do is kind of like point them and nudge them in the right direction. But if you do it too hard, you're definitely going to be, you turn them off quickly. But I would really push it if they have children, especially. I mean, something we haven't talked about really about EMFs. Children are so much more susceptible to the negative health effects of electromagnetic fields from a technology because of their smaller body size or higher biological water content and the developing nature of their brains and biology. So if you can guilt trip people into like maybe, worrying about their children first, which they should, that might be an entry point. But you could also very much offend any parent by telling them what to do. So
yeah, that's definitely
it's a fine line to walk.
Yeah, that's definitely been a slippery slope that I've been on both sides of recently with families of friends I know.
Yeah.
Tristan and Ryan, before you guys go, sorry, it's Tim again. I just had one question that I just remembered to ask. Your episode with Dr. Arturo Solis Herrera, I listened to that, and I was just curious, like, I know he didn't really answer the best ways to increase melanin. I felt like he kind of was like, he said things that were like, listen to a good lecture, dance, but I know he like, doesn't he sell like certain drops and stuff? And I'm just not sure if he's ever specified like what's in those drops, or if anyone's ever taken them, or.
Yeah, we kind of tried to ask him about it, but the answer was never super clear. Because I remember Tristan asking him about, because he actually pulls out the drops at the end of the podcast somewhere in there, right? Because we were asking about dosage and stuff like that, and he just squirted the thing into like a glass, and so I was sort of like, cautiously hesitant, to look into it further. But yeah, I don't know about you, Tristan, thoughts on that since the podcast.
Whenever anyone pulls out a supplement, I'm always very skeptical. He mentioned it was just kind of like precursor to melanin, which, I mean, what are the real precursors to melanin is sunlight exposure and, like tyrosine, which is aromatic amino acid. So we know that, the best ways to obviously increase melanin would be to get sun exposure. And for him as well is I guess living kind of like a low stress, happy life style. So yeah, that was a fun podcast conversation, but definitely a few things he mentioned that I was like, all right, okay.
I know personally, the longer I've been in the game, the more and more I've realized that you just got to listen to like what the fundamentals are,
right,
and lean into it. Because I've tried to out supplement so much stuff in my life that it just like, and it never works ever. I pretty much threw everything away. because if you don't even have the basics down and you're really not taking advantage of the nature that you can around you at all, it doesn't fucking matter. So that's sort of like where I've really found actual success, was really like just being really hard and rigorous with fundamental principles. But yeah.
Yeah, I just because I was curious, like, just nobody ever really feel like talks. Obviously, sunlight increases melanin, right? And you would think that eating like higher copper foods, because that increases
Yeah.
melanocytes,
Mm.
so getting liver. But then I was curious about things like chaga mushrooms or shilajit or black seed oil, things that are known to kind of like have melanin. If anyone's ever came out and said that like those would be things that would increase melanin in the skin.
High melanin content foods. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I mean, it's totally plausible, but I think, like you said, kind of getting the precursors, the copper, that's like a huge, cofactor in all those like tyrosinase, enzymatic processes, and also, your gut microbiome, because that's where, a lot of the aromatics are kind of doing their work, but they're also, again, it's very light dependent. So
Right.
I would be
Yep.
very cautious of using, antibiotics, antimicrobials, and embracing your local species pool, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yep.
always really helpful. It always comes down to the same stuff, and yeah, I mean that could be a way, with the very dark compounds, but I
Well,
don't know.
that's what I was thinking, just because of like the black color of it and how obviously melanin's black. And like, I was just wondering, like, even something like activated charcoal, I'm like, is there a link there, with just the black and the fact that it absorbs like so many things in your body and toxins? Like, I'm like, is that connected to melanin? I don't know. I'm just thinking outside the box.
It's a good thought. Yeah, be hard to say, but I think sticking to the principles of what we know for sure, and getting as much sunlight as possible is definitely the best way, I would
Sure.
say.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Thanks, Tim.
Cool.
All right, last call for anyone else. And yeah, this will be on our Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Fountain Podcast as well. So again, yeah, follow us, Decentralized Radio, the Twitter account that Ryan's speaking off of, posting clips, posting updates, and yeah, check us out. Gonna definitely have a lot more episodes coming on EMFs and all things decentralized health. So thanks for tuning in.